Hello everyone. In the previous video, we looked into the aspect of the various free radical initiators, and we looked into different types of free radical initiators. Today, we will look into the exact mechanism by which the free radical polymerization happens. And from your previous semester classes, you might have come across the mechanism that is involving a free radical species. And you know that often the free radical species involve uh, a three-step. Okay, yeah, we have the first step involving an initiation step, then the second step involving a propagation step, okay, and the third step involving a termination step. So often these three stages you are pretty involved, pretty aware of from your previous semester classes about your acquaintance with the free radical reaction mechanism. So almost all these three stages you will find here in the free radical polymerization as well. So we'll be looking into each of these three stages and try to understand them in little detail in terms of your polymer chemistry. Okay, so let us start with the initiation. So the first step in a free radical polymerization is the initiation. Okay, so the initiation involves you have the generation from the free radical initiator, you have generation of a radical species. Okay, and this radical species is activating the monomer by reaction to form a initiator monomer radical. So this is called initiator monomer radical. So this particular reaction is pretty easy to understand. As you can see here, uh, you can have a arrow something going like this. So you can have homolysis of this doubly bonded thing happening. So you have a radical generation here as well as a radical generation here. So this initiator radical combines with this carbon radical to form a bond here, and you are left with a radical here. So this particular species that is generated here, this is called as the initiator radical initiator monomer radical. Okay, so that is what it is formed. So this involves your first step, that is your initiation step. That means it involves two processes. First is the formation of the initiator radical, and second process is the activation of the monomer by forming a initiator monomer radical. So that is how the first step happens. It's pretty simple to understand, and you are also pretty aware of it. Okay, let's move further and look into the next step that is involved in this reaction. Okay, so the next step, let me clear out these symbols that are here because otherwise they will interfere with our discussion here. Okay, so what do you see here? The next step in our free radical polymerization is nothing but your propagation step. So propagation step means it is involved in your chain growth. Okay, so initially you have the initiator monomer radical being formed, or we can say that monomer is activated now. Now the rest of the monomer in that reaction mixture is going to now add on to this activated monomer. Okay, so this is a unactivated monomer. Now the monomers present in the reaction mixture keep adding on to this activated monomer here. So that is what is happening here. So in the next step, it is the propagation step. So here you have again a similar kind of reaction happening. So let me draw that for you. So you have a homolysis of one of the bond happening here. So you will draw it with half arrows. Okay, so you have radical generation here and radical generation here, and you have these radical combining with this to form a bond here. Okay, and then one radical is left behind. Now other monomers keep joining and you get a chain of a polymer that is formed here as a result of addition of the monomer onto the activated radical here. Okay, so this is how the propagation step happens. Now here, what I wanted you to know is that the addition that happens, the manner in which it happens is usually via a head to tail orientation. Now, what do you mean by a head to tail orientation? So in this particular species, this particular part, okay, this particular part, okay, that is CHY, is actually called your head, okay, and this particular part is called your tail part. This particular part is called your tail part. Okay, so now if we continue with our discussion. Okay, so what do we find here? I told you this is the head and this is the tail. Now in this monomer, this particular part, that is CHY, would be your head and this particular part would be your tail. So now this activated monomer is adding on to the tail part, okay, and then you have a radical generated at the head part. Now this will further react with the other monomer in a head to tail fashion. So you can see head is adding on to the tail. Similarly, every place you can see head is adding on to the tail. Here also head is adding on to the tail here. Okay, so the addition is always happening in a predominant way in the head to tail orientation. Okay, so that is actually decided by these two factors, that is the uh, steric repulsions as well as the electronic effects. Okay, so these are the two basic factors that is actually determining the addition happening in the head to tail fashion. So this particular head part is little bit bulky, so it will try to add on to a place which is not bulky. So CH2 with no substituent attached is less bulky, so that is why this head to tail orientation is favored. Another effect is electronic effect, because once it forms a bond here and you have a radical generated here, a group here attached can stabilize this radical. So that also is another additional feature that is actually responsible for this growth of polymer happening in this head to tail orientation. But this is not very exclusive. We can find certain exceptions, as you can see here. In this particular slide, you find that certain polymers, like the one involving vinyl fluoride or vinylidene fluoride, or this type of ester polymer, all have head-to-head head-to-head orientation happening at certain percentages, though majority of the polymerization is happening in a head-to-tail fashion, but you definitely find certain percentages of head-to-head orientation. That means a bulky group attaching at this particular position. So that also is observed to a small percentage in these particular groupings, probably because when a radical is generated here, the fluorine doesn't that much stabilize here in this case. So probably, and also the steric nature of the fluorine is considerably lower. Okay, so that is probably one reason why you will find a head-to-head orientation also, along with the head-to-tail orientation of the monomers in the polymer chain. Here again, probably the electronic effect, because the radical is not very well stabilized by this group. And apart from that, since it's not a group here, but it's a CH2 and ester group here. So once you write the three-dimensional orientation, the ester can point in this particular direction, thus not interfering with the combination of the other radicals. So probably that's why this also shows some percentage of head-to-head orientation. So a combination of steric factors and electronic factors are responsible for all this way in which the monomer is attached in a polymer chain. But if you are asked in general what is the fashion in which it is attached, the usual orientation is head-to-tail orientation. Even in these exceptions also, the majority orientation is head-to-tail orientation, but few head-to-head orientations you will find, as you can see from these percentages. Okay. Moving on further, we have here the termination step being discussed here. Okay, so apart from propagation, you have another important step involved in the free radical polymerization, and that is nothing but your uh, termination step. Okay, so termination involves a few methods by which the termination can happen. One of the method by which termination can happen is radical coupling or radical combination. So what you can see here is you have a growing chain with the end of the chain having the radical, and you can have 2 3 chains in a particular reaction mixture. So these uh, radical containing chains can then combine to form a neutral polymer chain. Okay, so that is one way in which like the radicals combining with each other to form a neutral species, and thereby, so this is the polystyryl radical. Okay, and they combine with two polystyryl radical combined to form a neutral way. So by radical combination or recombination or coupling, we can have the chain terminated. Another way the chain can terminate is by radical disproportionation. Now it's slightly different from radical combination. So what here is happening is that you have here a growing polymer chain, and this is another growing polymer chain. So what happens is that this particular growing radical chain will abstract. Okay, so since this particular polymer chain will abstract one of the alpha hydrogen here, okay, and thereby we have a double bond formation happening, and you get a terminated, this particular chain being terminated here. Now this will take the H hydrogen radical here produced as a result of homolytic cleavage of the CH bond and forms a neutral species in this particular fashion. So here you can see at the end of the chain, one of the species is containing the double bond, another species is kind of saturated form. So this is what is happening in a disproportionation reaction. So one of the growing chain is accepting a kind of radical from the other species and thereby getting neutralized in the process. So in this case, this particular growing chain is accepting a radical from this growing chain and thereby getting converted into a saturated neutral molecule, and the other in the process get converted to a alkene substance. So this is the polymerization using the methyl acrylate. So you have the radical here. It's not shown here. There is a radical formation here. Okay, I'll show that for you. So it's a radical basically here. So what is happening? You have this polymethacrylate, methyl methacrylate. So methyl methacrylate radical here. Okay. So they can combine by recombination, but it doesn't happen. This particular polymer will prefer to undergo termination via radical disproportionation. So what is happening? One of the radical is accepting the proton, not proton, the hydrogen radical from the alpha position. So from this alpha position, it is accepting one of the hydrogen to get into a neutral state, and thereby one of the double bond is created here. So I hope you are understanding how this particular reaction is happening. So if you have any clarification, we can discuss that in the live session. So alpha hydrogen abstraction can happen from this position as well as this position also. So that's why you have double bond here as well being generated. Now you might have the question like how we will know whether a particular polymer will be undergoing termination via radical recombination or coupling or via disproportionation. How can we decide? So that is actually determined by these factors. Like if suppose your growing radical is sterically crowded, like in this particular case, like polymethyl methacrylate, okay, such sterically crowded radical won't undergo a radical combination, because radical combination would be highly hindered, because if another head comes and join here, there would be too much electric steric hindrance there. So whenever there is sterically bulky groups at the growing radical end, then they won't usually undergo a radical combination, but rather they will prefer to undergo disproportionation reaction. Okay. Another one is if you have repulsive groups like ester. So in this particular case, you have a ester grouping. So ester grouping, because of their pi clouds on the COO bond, they generate a lot of electronic repulsions, okay, to an adjacent similar group. So that if you have an ester group present, they also less prefer to undergo recombination, but they will prefer to undergo a disproportionation reaction via alpha hydrogen abstraction. And then another thing is the ease with which alpha hydrogen abstraction can take place. So if it is easy to abstract a alpha hydrogen, they would prefer to undergo disproportionation reaction. Okay, so when it all depends upon these three factors. So for your just for trying sake, let us look into these particular examples here. So you can see here, I have told you two different examples. So you have polyacrylonitrile. So this is the structure, polyvinyl acetate. Okay. So the question asked to you is which of them undergo by recombination and which one will undergo via uh, a kind of disproportionation reactions. That's my question to you. So you can pause the video and then try to answer it, and then uh, uh, remove the pause, and then you can watch the correct answer. So the correct answer would be, so let me move the slide ahead. So the correct answer is the first one is polyacrylonitrile. They will prefer to undergo radical recombination. That means a radical combination or coupling. Okay. Why? Because they are not sterically that crowded. It's CN is a very small group, so it's not very sterically crowded. So they will prefer to undergo radical combination. So wherever the case of sterics is not coming into the picture, usually the termination try to find root via radical coupling. Okay, but in this case, polyvinyl acetate, as you can see, you have an ester grouping present. Okay, so it will lead to a lot of electronic repulsion. So therefore, in this particular case, they undergo a kind of disproportionation reaction. Okay, so this is how basically we decide whether a particular reaction will undergo termination by a coupling pathway or via disproportionation pathway. Okay. Finally, in the final video, I'll be looking into the another process that is apart from this initiation, propagation, and termination. There is a fourth process also that can happen in a free radical polymerization that I'll be discussing in the next video. So thank you very much for your attention.